Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're going to give people another minute or so to get into the room. As with all our webinars, I think we're all gotten used to this format, but at any time you can ask questions in the question bar on your screen, or if you're just listening in via phone call, go ahead and email me a question, eric@harbortrucker.com, and I'll read them off during our Q&A section. So let me just tell you a little bit about our presenter today. Many of you probably have already met him or at least know his work. For those of you that are meeting for the first time, Dan Smith has about 4 decades of consulting experience in the freight transportation industry. Ports, railroads, shippers, the Department of Transportation, they've all called on his expertise. He's even given expert testimony in the House Judiciary Committee on global shipping industry. So he's really got a lot of experience in this area. He's authored multiple long-term cargo forecasts for both the San Pedro Bay ports in the Bay Area, consulted on competition models, capacity studies, and he's worked for a lot of different stakeholders. He's been doing freight movement work in the Bay Area for about 35 years now. And so he's really got some specific insight on the Bay Area's transportation systems. And today he's going to give us a virtual summary of the recent Bay Area Seaport forecast that he did for the Bay Conservation and Development Commission. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dan.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today, and thanks for all the HTA members, the MTOs, and the ports that helped us with the study. As Eric said, we've been doing this for a long time, but none of it is possible except that the industry's people cooperate with us, answer our questions, steer us right when we're wrong, and we couldn't do it without that industry cooperation. As most of you know, the Oakland A's have proposed building a stadium and housing complex at the Port of Oakland on the site of Howard Terminal, which is currently used for truck parking and other support activities. BCDC, which is the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, has designated that site as port priority, which means you cannot use it permanently for non-port functions. To remove the port priority designation, BCDC needs a cargo forecast and capacity study to determine if the Bay Area could do without that space in the future. Tioga and Hackett Associates did the study under BCDC's supervision, with the A's paying the bills. Now, there are no recommendations in the report. Our task and our commitment to both BCDC and the A's was to provide the best set of facts we could assemble to support BCDC's deliberations and eventual decision. We have 5 active port complexes on the bay, in addition to the private terminals. We handle a pretty wide range of cargo types and commodities. Our work focused on container cargo, all of which now is moved through Oakland, the roll-on, roll-off vehicles, which move through Benicia, Richmond, and San Francisco, and dry bulk cargoes, which actually move through all of the port complexes if you include Schnitzer Steel in the Oakland Harbor. You'll note that non-petroleum liquid bulk and break bulk are grayed out here. The liquid bulk is limited in scope and presented no capacity issues. And right now there's no break bulk cargo at Bay Area ports. We took a look at the available economic outlook reports from government agencies, banks, regional development agencies, so forth, to identify the primary trends that would propel the cargo growth. Population growth in particular is a good proxy for consumer demand, which in turn drives containerized, ro-ro, and dry bulk cargo import volumes. In the short term, Northern California personal income growth will outpace the natural levels, but the labor growth here is going to lag. Short-term population growth is projected to be at near record lows for Northern California. Particularly in the Bay Area, the lack of affordable housing and the high cost of living has been cited as a major impediment to growth. In the long term, overall GDP growth is projected to slow to about 1.9%. For the 19-county region around the Bay Area, real personal income is expected to grow at 1.7%, employment around 1%, but population at only 0.7%. And as all of you know, right now, the trade outlook is very murky. Ongoing trade tensions and continuing economic uncertainty all point towards short-term declines in trade growth, and we saw that starting to happen before COVID hit. Tariffs will reduce the trade volumes at West Coast ports in the short term, but much of that should return depending on the length of the disputes, where manufacturing production shifts, and where we find markets for California exports. The net impact of COVID-19 on trade is anybody's guess at the moment. The most recent Port of Oakland expectation is a 5 to 10% drop for 2020, but the real issue is the nature and length of the recovery, which we've yet to see. Here's what's been happening with container trade at Oakland, and I don't think it would be a surprise to anyone on the call. The port recession recovery took longer than most anybody thought, and volumes were almost flat from 2010 through 2013. The issues over contract renewal in 2014, 2015 also held back growth a bit. Then things picked up, partly because import front-loading in anticipation of the tariff hits. And just when we thought things were getting back to normal, we had a pandemic. Now, interestingly, Oakland's loaded container volume through April 2020 is actually up over 2019 because the export growth here was greater than the import drop. The total volume at Oakland is down right now because the empties have not been moving. Now, the first thing I take away from this record is that the word normal has lost any meaning in this business. Second, the average annual growth rate from 1998 through 2018 was 2.41%. We had forecast slightly lower growth at 2.25% out to 2050. Now, when we got the 2019 numbers, the new historical growth rate shifted to 2.23%. So the actuals moved closer to our forecast. That makes us look really good in the short term, but again, it's a long-term study and a long-term issue. We developed moderate growth, slow growth, and strong growth scenarios for all the cargo types. The container forecasts are based on Moody's economic growth projections and the separate projections we found for the Bay Area and Northern California. We forecast import loads, export loads, international empties, domestic inbound, domestic outbound, and domestic empties all separately with appropriate drivers and assumptions for each flow. So the overall growth rates are not the forecast. Really what the forecast was 6 different forecasts for different parts of the cargo that together yielded that long-term growth average. For containerized imports, we included new first call vessel services in the moderate and strong growth scenarios. We assumed a new first call service from each of the 3 alliances with the implementation spread over a 3-year period. Effectively, we're assuming that one alliance puts in a new first call, it works, and the other alliances follow. This adds between 200 and 250,000 annual TEU, depending upon when the services are introduced. The slow and strong growth scenarios had different assumptions about economic growth and near-term disruptions due to trade disputes. And then domestic growth was set at 3 different growth rates between 0.5% and 2.3% for Matson, who's the dominant carrier, combined with a varying share of non-Matson cargo. So we've got a pretty complex forecast, but here's what it gets you. The moderate growth scenario for containers anticipates 3.1% growth for imports, slower growth at exports at 1.3%, and 0.7% growth for domestic. If you add in the empties, the total TEU grow at about 2.2%. Now, if you look at the chart, you'll see that that 2.2% is not constant because we've allowed for what we all saw coming in the way of a short-term trade disruption after the front loading. Now, again, that does not include any predictions for how COVID plays out, but we do see shorter term growth in the long run and then a resumption to trend later. The average growth for the short-term scenario was 1.4%. The average for the strong growth was at 3.3%. And here you can see where we added in those the bump up from the first call vessels. This splits out the imports, exports, and domestic. You can see that we're expecting stronger growth than we had in 2010 through 2018, because as you recall, that was the flat period after the recession. So with the resumption of steadier growth, we're expecting the imports to grow up to about a little over 2.7 million, the exports up to about 2.3 million TEU. So we'll have a little bit more imports than exports, but still a much closer balance than most US ports. And we'll have about 0.2 million domestic TEU. With that forecast in hand, we looked at the existing and available container terminal space at Oakland to handle the expected container cargo. Oakland has 4 active container terminals and 5 sites where we could expand or supplement their capacity. A couple of words of caution on our assumptions here. We looked at aggregate acreage, assuming that terminal boundaries, terminal operators, and ocean carrier assignments could change over the next 30 years, because they've certainly changed over the past 32 years. Right now, Shippers Transport is operating a 30-acre staging lot out toward the middle of this map. That provides supplementary capacity to OICT at the present, but we assume that property will eventually be developed for other uses in accordance with the port's plans. And then the Roundhouse property, which is down at the bottom of the map here, doesn't have its own water access. So its role would be additional backlands for the Matson terminal there. You can also see here that the acreage declines between what we've called build-out acres and what we've called post-electrification acres. We know all the Bay Area terminals, but particularly the Oakland container terminals, are anticipating electrifying their operations to be able to meet emissions goals. That takes space. And we have allowed 2 acres at each terminal for battery exchange operations, additional substations, or whatever's required to implement the electrification. Now, container terminal productivity is a complex topic with a lot of industry discussion over the type and extent of automation and the most effective approach. We tried very hard to ground our estimates in what different types of terminals were achieving rather than what they might achieve. And we defined 2 different numbers. We defined maximum capacity, which we think is generally what terminals publish and equates to maximum throughput under ideal conditions. And then we defined sustainable capacity, set at 80% of the maximum as a rule of thumb. And that represents what we can expect to consistently achieve in the long term, given peaking, variable vessel operations, variable trade flows, and all the other things that complicate the life of marine terminal operators. So the 2 benchmarks we set were the OICT current sustainable capacity that we estimate at 66, 68 TEU per acre. We've essentially assumed that other Oakland operations would be able to come to that benchmark using conventional methods. And then we defined high productivity at 7,112 TEU per acre. And that was drawn from the sample you see shaded in green with higher productivity terminals at other ports, including a couple of international examples. And by the way, the benchmarking effort here was really limited by the fact that most terminals in the US have no capacity estimates. So rather than guess, we use the published estimates wherever we could find them. Now, as you see down at the bottom, there are some productivity claims, even much higher for a couple of terminals. But the thing is that none of those terminals have achieved those throughputs yet. And there are some reasons to believe that those estimates might be a little optimistic. So we did not include those. So then we had to figure out how these things are going to expand. The quickest and easiest way to expand capacity is to expand horizontally onto adjacent land. So we defined a series of 6 expansion phases that started by expanding onto additional land and then gradually bringing in higher productivity methods on a portion of the port property. The low-cost horizontal expansion on available terminal acres there, phase 1, that gets us to about 5.2 million annual TEU in capacity. We progressively shift more land out of conventional operations to higher productivity operations. And you can see down at the bottom that the average capacity TEU per acres grows pretty slowly because we're only shifting 150 acres at a time rather than throwing the switch on the whole port at once. So by the time we're up in phase 6 and we're at 7,112 annual TEU per year for the whole port, we're up at about 5.4 million TEU. Now, note that there are no dates attached to any of this. We're basically assuming that marine terminals, like most facilities, try to stay just ahead of the demand curve rather than investing very heavily and winding up with a bunch of underused capacity for 5 years while demand catches up. Also notice that it really doesn't make any difference to the estimate which acreage is converted to higher productivity when, or which terminal converts, since the estimates are really for the total, not terminal by terminal. And then note again that the available acreage actually goes down somewhat in the later phases. In phase 1, we had 779 acres, but we wind up at 767 acres in phase 6 because of the allowance for electrification. Now, with a few fewer numbers, this sort of summarizes the balance between demand and capacity looking out to 2050. With moderate growth, all the available post-electrification acres, and what we see as higher productivity, we would be at about 93% of the Port of Oakland's capacity in 2050. If we use some of the land for other purposes, we take out Howard or we take out berths 2021, where there's a proposal for an interim bulk cargo facility there, then we're at 95, 98% of capacity. And if we were to take them both out, we would be at 100% of capacity by 2050. Naturally, if we get much slower cargo growth, everything fits. If we get even faster cargo growth, we run out of space sooner and we wind up over capacity by 2050. And then down at the bottom here, translating into land requirements, our analysis suggests that we need about another 136 acres of land for container terminals by 2050. Again, slow growth, we'd have some in reserve. Strong growth, we would need a lot more space. Now, space for truck parking and ancillary services is really important to HTA members. Right now, as of early 2019, there are about 314 total acres around the Port of Oakland, either in use, under development, or available for ancillary services. And that includes the City of Oakland parcels and the Union Pacific parcels that are shown over there on the right, as well as the port-owned land. We did truck parking studies for the Port of Oakland in 2000 and updated in 2016. We pulled those models back up and reran them based on these new forecasts and what we knew about operating conditions now. And we came up with acreage requirements ranging from a minimum of 167 acres for slow growth, 269 acres for strong growth, and 209 acres for moderate growth. So with 314 acres in use, we've got space for the 209 acres for moderate growth, and we can easily do the 269 acres for strong growth. But Let me point out, though, that those ancillary services would primarily, in the long term, shift to warehousing, distribution, transloading, overnight parking. The port and the city together have a commitment for 30 acres forever, so that would remain. But there would be significantly less space available for trucking company operations, truck parking, and the things that are interim uses for terminals right now. Now, we also looked at the roll-on, roll-off vehicle traffic, imports and exports, because those functions also have to be accommodated in the Bay Area. And of course, they compete for space with container cargo. Here's that forecast. That's based mostly on long-term growth of vehicle miles traveled predicted by FHWA and on what we know about Bay Area exports, meaning right now, Tesla exports. The long-term growth rates for auto and truck imports are similar to those for container cargo because they're both being driven by population and economic growth. It's worth noting that between 2010 and 2018, imports have constituted almost all the RoRo traffic in the Bay Area. But there have been two trends that are important. One, imports of pickup trucks have increased quite a bit. They're still less than 5% of the total, but they are growing faster and they take up more space. And then passenger vehicle exports have boomed with Tesla beginning to export through Pier 80 over in San Francisco. And again, although exports are relatively small now, they're growing much faster than the imports. To handle all those import and export vehicles, we currently have active terminals at Benicia, at Richmond, and at San Francisco. Matson handles some vehicle business at Oakland, but those are usually private vehicles rather than imports or exports. RoRo terminals are basically big parking lots with some processing buildings and maybe some rail connections. The capacity of those terminals depends on how many you can park and how long they stay. Basically the same storage capacity and dwell time issue that containers have. Now, I'm guessing that a lot of people on this call own SUVs. A lot probably own pickups, and maybe some even own dual cab pickups. Those take up a lot more room. You can't park as many of those on an acre, and those are hot sellers and high growth items. There's a substantial number of Toyota Tacoma dual cab pickups that are actually imported by water from a plant in Mexico into the Bay Area. That plant, as far as we know, produces nothing but dual cab Tacomas. Toyota sells 4 times as many trucks as they sell Priuses, and they sell 10 times as many SUVs as they sell Priuses. So as the size of vehicle grows, our productivity tries to drop off a little bit. And you'll see that we allowed for different import shares of compacts, mid-size trucks, and created an average. Auto importers also differ in their shipping and processing strategies. Cars that move inland by rail may only stay a couple of days at the port, but cars that have accessories installed for local delivery, like Subarus, might be there 3 weeks. Now, export autos don't need processing, so they turn over much faster. So here too, we put together base scenarios for low, base case, and high productivity. And you see different weighted annual units per acre down in the far right, with a base case at a little less than 2,000 annual units per acre. Here's how that plays out in land requirements. With moderate growth in base case productivity in the middle of that chart down there, you can see that we're going to need about 160 additional acres for RoRo vehicles by 2050. And that's in line with reports that basically the ports of Benicia and Richmond are almost at capacity right now handling imports. The productivity is actually a bigger lever than the growth here, because if we get higher productivity across the board, we would only need, say, 63 acres, whereas if productivity sinks because we're bringing in more trucks and they're sitting longer, then we would need a lot more space. The takeaway here is about 160 acres for ro-ro cargo. The other piece is dry bulk cargoes. We looked at those too because they compete for Bay Area terminal space, and we need that stuff in the Bay Area. The dry bulk cargoes coming into the Bay Area include things like bauxite, slag, gypsum, and petroleum coke. But the big growth items are inbound sand and gravel and outbound scrap metal. We're importing more sand and gravel into the Bay Area because demand is growing here and the domestic supplies are being depleted. Basically, nobody is creating new sand and gravel quarries in Northern California. And the available stockpiles are low. Now, the outlook for export scrap metal is uncertain, due in part to the reduction in the Chinese business. So we're predicting slower growth than in recent years. But Northern California scrap dealers are finding new markets, so we do see growth in that segment. Dry bulk terminal capacity is hard to analyze because it depends both on how much material we can store and how long it stays there. Again, storage capacity and dwell time, but it's a little trickier when we're talking about piles of gravel. We found a handful of benchmarks out there and tried to position low, base case, and high productivity scenarios between them. Current average is about 56,000 annual tons per acre. There is a proposal for a new dry bulk terminal at Oakland's berth 2021, and that would handle around 113,000 tons per acre. So we use that for the base case productivity under moderate growth that you see in the middle there. Now, there's an enclosed facility up at Eagle Rock, Richmond, and that has a capacity of about 146,000 annual tons per acre. So we use that as the high productivity benchmark. And then we use the existing average of about 56,000 as the low productivity benchmark. We also assumed that moderate growth and base case productivity would go together, as would the slow growth and low productivity and the strong growth and the high productivity. The implication here is that we would need about 30 more acres with moderate growth, none with slow growth, and about 75 with strong growth. For those of you who are wondering, if we looked at all the different scenarios for cargo types, high growth, strong growth, different forecasts, different capacities, and so forth, we actually have 1,944 different forecast combinations. And I don't think we have time to go through them one by one. So here's a simplified summary. If we get moderate growth across all cargo types, and base case productivity and the maximum productivity in container. That's the first row of the table there. And what it says is we need about 327 additional terminal acres by 2050. If we get slow growth, we need 98 terminal acres. If we get strong growth, we need 753. And in fact, at that point, we'd also need additional berth space for larger container vessels. Here's what the available sites look like. At Oakland, there is space between Everport and Trepac at what's nominally called berths 33 and 34. We assumed that that would be used for container because there's really nothing else you can do with that land. We have space in the former Ports America operation at berths 22 to 24, which we also assume will be used for containers. And as I mentioned, there is a proposal for a dry bulk operation at berths 20 to 21. The port says they would have the dry bulk operation there for about 15 years, and then that land would become available for containers again. So we've allowed it as long-term container capacity. Oakland also has the Roundhouse property you see down below, which has been used for a whole range of ancillary services over the years. And of course, Howard Terminal. the diagram on Howard Terminal there you see on the right, that curve is the land that would be lost from Howard Terminal due to expansion of the inner harbor turning basin. Now, Richmond's Terminal 3, which you see at the upper right, it's about a 20-acre property. It was most recently to transload export logs that you see there on the quay front. San Francisco Pier 96 is a former container terminal. You can see that there's a couple of container cranes still there. And the Port of San Francisco also has some other parcels that are part of the complex, which could be eventually used as part of the backlands. Here's the bottom line. We have about 356 acres to work with, either terminals idle, terminals in other uses, or land that could be added to terminals that's within the Bay Area's port priority designations. It looks like we need about 327 acres of that property. As I said, we assumed that Oakland's berth 22, 24, 33, 34, and even 2021 would eventually be used for containers, and that the Roundhouse property could be used as backland for the Matson container terminal. There used to be containers at Richmond's Terminal 3 and San Francisco's Piers 80, 94, and 96, but the industry has clearly concentrated itself at Oakland, and we don't see the industry diversifying to other ports, particularly now that we have the alliances in place. So other than containers, those other terminals are suitable for ro-ro or dry bulk operations. Port of Redwood City has some reserve capacity, but doesn't really have any real vacant land. Benicia can free up about 35 acres that are in short-term lease for other purposes. And that's what we've got to work with. Those acreage can be used in several combinations. We did not try to come up with any kind of optimal solution. So with moderate growth, we need 327 acres, and then we have maybe about a 29-acre reserve capacity within the Bay Area. And if you have slow growth, we only need 90 acres. If we have strong growth, we would need a lot more land than we have available. Now, you could think of it this way. We need about 327 more acres to handle 32 years worth of growth. That means each year we need to find the equivalent of about 10 new acres worth of capacity, either by building out or building up. And in fact, over the years, it's going to be a combination of those two strategies. So overall, the analysis was very complex, but the findings are really relatively straightforward. With moderate container, ro-ro, and dry bulk cargo growth, the Bay Area capacity is going to be very tight by the time we get to 2050. We will have about 29 acres in reserve. The Port of Oakland could probably handle moderate container growth to 2050 without Howard Terminal, but at that point, they would have basically no room for further growth. It'd be tapped out. The Bay Area could probably meet the 2050 ro-ro cargo growth needs using San Francisco Pier 96, Richmond's Terminal 3, the expansion at Benicia in some combination. But part of that depends on the ability of the port to integrate Terminal 3 with the existing ro-ro terminal, which is on the other side of the water at Port of Richmond. If Howard Terminal were available, it could pick up some of the ro-ro cargo load. The dry bulk capacity could go to San Francisco, Richmond, or Oakland, but that could conflict with the ro-ro and container needs. So basically, waterfront terminal sites are a finite resource, and once capacity gets tight like this, we have to work through the choices and the trade-off, and that's really BCDC's policy decision to make. The commission is going to meet again virtually on June 4th. And I believe this final report will be made available at that time and will be up on the BCDC website for downloading. There was the last draft was made available for the Seaport Plan Advisory Committee a couple weeks ago, but it will be the final version that should be available shortly. Now, that June 4th commission meeting is not going to address the A's proposal. That will come at a later date. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
All right, thank you, Dan. So we're going to open it up to questions now. So go ahead and enter any questions that you have into our question box below or send them to my email. One of the questions that came in was, Oakland is a traditionally balanced port. Do you see limited capacity changing that balance or upsetting that balance in any way?
I don't think so. The export business is very, very important to Oakland. That's one of the reasons the vessel operators call here. They really like the balance. So I think the balance is one of Oakland's strongest selling points to the ocean carriers. And I think that they'll put every effort to maintain that balance.
All right. And then another question was, we're seeing some shifting supply chains in response to the COVID-19 crisis and, the ongoing trade disputes. We've been hearing about the China plus one policy approach that, we're going to keep some sourcing in China, but move somewhere else like Vietnam or Indonesia. Do you see that affecting the cargo forecast for the Bay Area and any of the cargo profiles that way?
We've allowed for some of that in what I call the trade disruptions. And we do know that as exports shift into Southeast Asia, they become more vulnerable to shifts to the Suez Canal. The thing is, the stuff that's more likely to shift to Suez is going to be the shipments to the Eastern US, to the Atlantic coast ports and into the Gulf. That puts the LA Long Beach market share at risk because right now, a lot of their business is rail intermodal coming from the Trans-Pacific and going into the east, southeast. Oakland doesn't have a lot of that traffic. Oakland's business is primarily serving northern central California and pieces of Nevada and southern Oregon. And I don't see shipments from Southeast Asia going all the way to the East Coast and then back across the US to Northern California. And in fact, Oakland just got a new vessel service from Vietnam. So I think that's a bigger issue and a bigger threat for the Southern California ports than for Oakland.
Thank you. So I have a question about the new IMO 2020 requirement using the low sulfur fuel. California is an emission control area. So our ships that are calling on our ports are already party to this and, they have no problem with compliance. But in other vessel areas, these carriers are going to have to now comply with this rule. Do you see them shifting some of that compliance cost over to our ports? And can you comment on the any of the competitive, or if we're going to lose any competitiveness by having that cost shifted to us?
Again, I don't think so. That's so much of an issue for Oakland. First of all, the ocean carriers are going to pass on whatever costs they can, but it depends upon the competitive context. If they keep having overcapacity, their ability to pass on cost increases is very limited. If at some future time they restrict the number of new mega vessels they order and capacity gets tight, then they're going to have better leverage to pass on cost increases. The thing about the IMO thing is raising the cost of maritime fuel handicaps the ports where you have to sail farther. So in fact, it's a little bit of a handicap for the services going through the Panama Canal all the way to the East Coast. And it tends to favor the West Coast just a little bit. I don't think that's a major swing factor for Oakland.
Great. That's good. That's good to hear. For the mega ships, how many berths currently can handle the mega ships in Oakland? And do you see, is there any appetite to develop more berths in the Bay Area to handle these mega ships?
Well, pretty much, as I said, the container industry is going to stay in Oakland. I don't see them moving out to the other other ports, particularly, like I said, with the alliance structure. Right now, OICT, the SSA operation, all their cranes, I don't think they have all their cranes upgraded yet, but they have enough cranes to handle mega vessels right now. They handled the MSC Anna, and they are routinely handling 14,000 TEU vessels there. In the outer harbor, the Trapac terminal, particularly the new portion that is on the former Ports America property, when they expanded, they have the capacity to handle mega vessels out there. In the long term, OICT is somewhat limited by the size of the turning basin. The turning basin in the Oakland estuary can handle vessels of maybe 14,000 to 15,000 TEU. But a number of years ago, when the Benjamin Franklin called, which is 17,000 TEU, they had to turn the Benjamin Franklin out in the bay rather than the inner harbor turning basin. And Oakland has proposals in the works to widen that turning basin. So the ability to handle mega ships is there and will probably increase. Oakland has the water depth they need for that. Okay. It does, however, lead to more cargo peaking, which is an issue.
Gotcha. We got a question that came in regarding rail activity. The comment is, there's no secret that Oakland's rail activity is underutilized. Was there any consideration in the analysis for utilizing the BNSF rail yard for future ancillary services?
Not really. That would involve pulling up some of the trackage. I think Oakland expects some growth in intermodal in the long run. Again, not as much as they used to. If I recall correctly, Oakland has maybe around 15% intermodal or something like that. And they don't see that growing to 20 or 30 or 40, 50 as it has in Southern California. But it is going to grow with trade. So I think those facilities will continue to be used. And frankly, we didn't see any mention of using the BNSF facility for anything but rail. I will say, though, that the Port of Oakland, their staff is absolute masters at figuring out how to use every inch of square space they've got. So I don't know if part of it becomes dormant. I would not be surprised if the Port of Oakland figured out how to use it to generate some revenue.
Understood. We got a question about what's going on over at Howard Terminal. Was the improvements for access to the port? With the improvements for access to the Port of Oakland, is there what kind of effect on the productivity forecast is included in the Tioga report when it comes to Howard Terminal?
When they were talking about the improvement to access, I don't know if they were talking about the big project, which is the 7th Street grade project, which is starting up, or if they were talking about potential changes that may have been proposed in connection with the A's development. We didn't limit the productivity discussion with truck access or rail access. Basically, we looked at the ability of the terminals to move the cargo through, in and out, and didn't restrict it one way or the other with the road access.
Okay. I'll send that question asker if they want to clarify. But in the meantime, you know, there was a comment that when looking at the different structures, that some of the drayage companies are feeling like they're being pushed a little bit out of Oakland in terms of their operations, where they can park and kind of things like that. The question is, are you seeing any input from drayage companies on, hey, we're having to move, or we're changing our operations to do with capacity issues?
We know that's going on, and that's in fact anticipated here. If you look at the long-term plans for the land around the port, right now we've got the Center Point development going up. The city of Oakland has one Prologis building up and operating. They plan more. Of course, things are a little bit stalled right now, But in the long term, the port and the cities see that property being developed primarily for higher value, higher revenue opportunities, meaning DCs, transloading, that sort of thing. There is that long-term, as far as I know, permanent commitment to make 30 acres of parking available for trucks, but that sort of caps the long-term commitment that the port and the public has. So in terms of trucking firms being pushed out of Oakland, just like they're being pushed out of every higher rent city, yeah, that's happening. And I think that will continue regardless of anything we do in the study.
Thank you, Dan. In regards to the transloading, that's that trend to have more cargo coming in on fewer ships. It seems like there's a couple of places that are trying to move to transloading, using that space for transloading. Do you think that's going to affect the cargo profile and capacity issues for the port? Do you see more transloading type cargo coming in?
Yes, probably more transloading. That's one of the reasons to develop that land for those kinds of facilities. It will be a mix. There are people in the Prologis facility doing transloading right now. The new Coolport development is a transloader. There's several others operating. So actually, I would see a mix of new transloading facilities plus redevelopment of what are some pretty old buildings right now to probably higher capacity, higher productivity facilities. And we're talking 32 years out. So I see that a gradual increase in particularly import transloading. Most of the transloading at Oakland has always been exports, and that will continue to be strong. But I think there will be more import transloading. And I think that's what those developments are aimed at becoming.
Okay. You mentioned that the port has the set aside for the 30 acres for parking and storage. There was a comment that they're hearing that the port is saying the requirement is only 15. Have you heard that there's been a change in that? I'm not exactly sure, question asker, what your question is, but that there is a shift in half that acreage set aside for parking and storage?
Technically, the commitment is 15 acres from the port and 15 acres from the city.
Okay.
As a practical matter, the port has always ponied up the city share as well as their own share. The question of how that share gets split is a matter for discussion between the city and the port, I think, over the next couple of decades.
Okay, gotcha, understood. So I'm going to go ahead and put out a last call for questions. It seems that they're slowing down. Have you heard of any private entities looking to supply any lost capacity to the port and selling their space to the port?
There's a couple of issues involved there. Our study focused on what I call port priority land, which is land that's set aside permanently for port operations. One example of that is out at Antioch. Amports has a new RoRo facility being developed out at Antioch, around 100 acres. And they are upgrading the water access so eventually it could be served by vessels. So that would add RoRo capacity to the greater Bay Area, but it's out of the bay itself, so it's not governed by BCDC. And the other thing is, because it's not priority, you can't guarantee that it'll still be used for that purpose 30 years out. If it's much more profitable for Amports to build condos there, it may become condos.
Gotcha.
And so the difficulty is designating areas and guaranteeing that they'll be available forever. There have been in the Bay Area from time to time individual terminals handling, there are a couple that handle sand and gravel in barges and things like that in different places. But again, there needs to be a guarantee that it will be available indefinitely if you're going to release the land.
Understood. So it looks like there's no more questions at this time, but if you guys have further questions for Dan, you can always send them over to me and I'll forward them along.
Absolutely.
Keep you in touch. We are going to be hosting Dan again in 2 weeks on June 10th for an autonomous vehicle information. If you want to give a little plug for that, Dan, and let people know, what you're going to be covering a little bit.
Sure, I'm going to be asking for some help. As I mentioned when we started here, we don't get good results in these studies without input from the industry. We are the lead contractor for a national highway cooperative research program that's sponsored by the Transportation Research Board and the National Academy of Sciences. And what they've asked us to do is trace the state and local impact and implications of automated freight vehicles, which can include drones and sidewalk robots, but for the purposes of this conversation, focusing on self-driving trucks in some matter. And so one of the big questions we want to answer with the industry's help is, if self-driving trucks become feasible and economical, where are they going to be deployed? Does it make sense to use them in the drayage industry? Does it make sense to use them in short-haul trucking? Is it only long-haul trucking? Is it only in the cities? Is it only in the countryside? And if I would love it if people thought a little bit about that topic on and off. And when we get together again, we can have a good conversation on that. And I can get some very valuable input from your membership.
Great. So, that registration's open live and we'll be e-blasting it to everybody. So in the meantime, if you have any more questions for Dan, you can send them my way. We're happy to have Dan here. He's, been a big part of the transportation industry for a long time. So we appreciate you taking the time to come speak with us. And with that, I think we'll close it out. All the HTA events, they're educational only. So we got to give that little disclaimer at the end that, if you don't repurpose it or publish it. But if you ever need to get in touch with myself or Dan, just go ahead and email me at any time. And, we want to thank you guys for coming in today. And that will close it out. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.